Welcome to Specific Lab. Today I'm going to show you how to make this awesome 2-in-1 downdraft table. Let's begin. Now every time I have done much sanding, I quickly noticed that sawdust went everywhere, not only on the table, but all over everything in the room. And the same thing was also true for my belt sander. And to combat that, I needed a downdraft table. I wanted this setup to be 24 inches by 18 inches, so I started cutting down some 1 by 6 inch boards. A quick test fit showed that this box was going to be bigger than I originally imagined, which makes it even better. Now the ends of the cuts were not very smooth, so I gave them a quick sanding on my belt sander to knock down any of the burrs. I then reassembled it to find the best location to make the hole for my 4-inch drainage PVC coupling. I centered the location of the hole into the wood, and using a 4-inch hole saw, I carefully drilled a hole through the wood, minimizing the tear out on the back by placing a second piece of wood underneath and holding everything together with a clamp. The hole turned out quite nice and did not require any additional sanding. A quick test fit with the PVC coupling showed an almost perfect fit. I next set up my pocket hole jig and drilled 4 holes into the 2 longest boards, making sure to keep them wide enough to avoid the 4-inch hole. I then screwed them all together. With the box frame complete, it was now time to measure out the PVC pipe that would fit inside. Since pressure will not be a concern, I'm using a thinner walled sewage and drainage PVC pipe to minimize the weight of the table. I then added an end cap to the pipe and measured and marked the location. I carefully trimmed the pipe as straight as I could with a handsaw and then removed as many of the burrs as possible with a file. Another quick test fit gave me the best location for the end cap. I then drilled a center hole through the end cap and then transferred that hole over to the marked location on the box. I then cut out a small square from a piece of 1 by 3 that would fit inside the cap to allow me to hold everything together. From the outside of the box, I found the hole that went through the cap and made a countersink for a screw. I made sure everything was lined up and drilled the screw into place. The inside wood was still a little loose, so I gave it a twist to tighten it up. A quick test fit showed everything secure. I then drew several lines about 1 inch apart using a straight edge along the side of the pipe. And I marked several locations along each line at about 1 inch apart. These will be the locations of the air holes in the pipe. The holes in the pegboard I plan to use are about 1/4 inch, so that is the same size bit I will use for the holes in the pipe. Now I'm sure I'll get the question of why I'm drilling holes into the PVC pipe and inserting it into the box. Well, this is kind of an experimental setup. I want to make sure I can use it on its side and when it's flat. By doing that, I don't know the exact location of the best place for the vacuum port. So by having holes in the pipe and inserting into the box, I can then, if need be, go back and put some tape on certain locations to help regulate where the best section place will be. And that way I can make sure I can get the most dust through the box into the pipe as possible. I then drilled out all the holes, making sure to keep them as straight as possible. And the end result turned out quite nice. I then went over all the holes with 120 grit sandpaper and a small file to smooth everything out. Going back to the end, I decided to add a layer of hot glue to the screw and the wood to help prevent it from coming loose in the future. This looks a little crude, but it won't be seen when finished. I then placed the tube inside the box, making sure the holes face toward the other side. Next, I flipped the box over and leveled it out with another piece of wood so that I could add a layer of hot glue around the coupling to make sure it stayed securely in place. For the bottom of the box, I had a scrap piece of plywood that was almost the perfect length, but it just needed to be trimmed for the width. I took a quick measurement and took it over to my table saw for a quick cut, and then gave it a quick sanding with 120 grit paper to remove most of the rough edges. I then tapped holes and added screws to several locations to keep it secured to the bottom. The box was really coming along, and then I realized I forgot to add caulking along all of the gaps to minimize air loss. For all of the open corners, I just used my caulk gun, but in all of the tight locations, I had to use a large craft stick to reach and apply it where needed. I then used my table saw to trim the pegboard to the size of the box. And with a quick test, I realized the center of the pegboard was too flexible and needed some reinforcement. So I measured and trimmed out a 1 by 2 furring strip to fit in the middle. I then added a couple of screws to each side to hold it in place. This gave the pegboard plenty of strength. Next, I wanted to add a small ramp to help direct the airflow towards the PVC pipe. Fortunately, I had an old piece of wood paneling from a previous project that fit perfectly in place. So I added another furring strip to the inside of the box with a couple of screws to support the panel. I then angled the panel and secured it in place with a couple more screws. Next up was attaching a reducer to the PVC pipe so that I could add my vacuum hose. But first, I needed to add a small pipe insert into the coupling to reduce the size. I made a couple of measurements and used a handsaw to trim it down. At this point, I decided to stain the wood a darker color to give it more of a professional look, and it looked better than I expected. And I decided to modify the pegboard as well. Now the one thing about using your pegboard as a sanding surface is that the white side is real smooth. So if you're using an orbital sand, your stuff's going to want to walk around. So I am going to try and use this dark back side here. Now this is already kind of rough in texture, but there's still a chance of stuff moving around. So I'm going to coat it in this Plastidip, which will hopefully give me a nice rubbery type surface on this already textured surface, and thus two of those combined will now create a great grip for whatever you put on the sand. Now here's the finished product. It did turn out a little bit darker than I was hoping, but overall I think it's going to work great. I can feel it with my fingers. It wants to grip really good, so I have a feeling that is going to make a great sanding surface. And if by chance I don't like it, take it off, flip it over, and I can put the other side back on. Once everything had dried, I decided to return to attaching the reducer. Now there was still a lot of play between the reducer and the pipe, so I decided to add some black tape to reduce the gap. This did the trick and made the seal very tight, but I decided to add a little bit of hot glue on the inside to help prevent any slippage. I then inserted a pipe into the coupling and moved on to installing the pegboard. I simply added a few screws through the pegboard into the wood to hold it securely in place, so that if needed I could always remove it and do any maintenance. It was now time to hook up my vacuum and give this tool a test. So I grabbed a piece of scrap wood and started sanding for about 2 minutes straight. At the end of the test, there was some sawdust still on top of the pegboard, but most of it had been sucked through the holes, and there was very little airborne dust in my shop. With that test a success, I decided to see if it would work with my belt sander. So I flipped it on edge and slid it into place. And after about a minute, I realized the belt sander had a bunch of sawdust on the table around it, but there was very little airborne dust, so I will call this a partial success. And just for the heck of it, I tried placing it behind my miter saw. And as you might expect, it did not work very well. Another benefit of this downdraft table is its size and ability to fit very well under my router station that I had built in a previous video. I will put a link to that video in the description below. Now I hope you're as excited about this as I am. This is going to cut down a ton on the dust that circulates in my shop. Now, there's a couple upgrades you can do to improve on this. First, if you want to maybe put some anti-slip feet on the bottom, so it'll be a little bit less chance of it walking around. And you could also put maybe some sides on it that go up a little bit to direct the airflow more down and into instead of just kind of in from the sides. But either way, this works great as is, and I'm happy with it. So if you like this project, make sure you click a like button, tell us what you think about it in the comments, and as always, have fun building.